Hi everyone, my name's Jason. I'm a program manager at Microsoft, and today we're going to do a follow-along style tutorial that'll show you how to deploy a Spring Boot application onto Azure App Service. And so for this tutorial, you don't really need much. All you need to have is an Azure subscription, and for that you'll need a credit card, and you'll also need a GitHub account. But if you clicked on this link, I'm willing to bet you have one of those or hopefully both of them. And you should also have Java installed locally, and you'll need Maven as well. But I think that goes without saying. So in this tutorial, we're going to create an Azure Web App. We're going to deploy our Spring Boot application on top of that web app. But then we're also going to wire up on a CI/CD pipeline from our GitHub repository to that web app. And so if you're not familiar with CI/CD, that stands for continuous integration and continuous delivery. So when I said that we're going to create a CI/CD pipeline from our repository to the web app, that means every time you or someone on your team makes a commit to that repository, then that'll trigger a pipeline to run that will build and test your code. And if the tests pass and the build is good, then it will get deployed onto the web app. So this means that there's really no manual intervention needed to deploy your web app. You don't have to do anything from your dev box. You can just merge pull requests into the main branch, and assuming that the tests pass okay, then it'll continuously deploy CD into the web app. Now, I know that sounds like a whole lot, but the portal, the Azure portal, makes it really easy to set all this up. So let's go ahead and get started. Make sure you have the portal open. That's portal.azure.com. And also open GitHub. And I want you to navigate over to this URL. I'll put it down in the description. But this is just a really simple Spring Boot application. I literally just made this off the Spring Initializer site, if you're familiar with that, and just added a simple controller route to it. So let's take a quick look at the application. Here I've got it open in VS Code, and like I said, it's pretty simple. There's the main class, there's just one controller, and then just one route on that controller. And all it says is hello from Spring Boot, nothing special. And I should actually already have this running. So if we browse over to 8080, there we go. Pretty simple, just says hello from Spring Boot. Not much going on there. And then in the later videos, we're going to build on this example because there's some other cool things with Spring Boot on App Service that I want to show, like how to use staging slots, how to wire a database, that's pretty common, how you can use key vault references to encrypt your secrets and those connection strings. And then towards the end, I'd like to talk about Vue.js with Spring Boot because I'm a big fan of Vue.js. So once you have the application cloned or forked, make sure you pull it locally and that you're able to build and run that on your local machine. So once you've done that, we're going to hop into the Azure portal. So I'll maximize this. And then once you're at this screen, we're going to create a resource. And then right down here, you can see there's a button for a web app. So we'll click that guy. And now if you've never used Azure before, this is what we call the create blade. So if you were to create a virtual machine on Azure or create a database on Azure, you'll see a screen that looks a lot like this one, where you provide some information, you go through validation, and then once you hit submit, that resource will get created and provisioned for you. So the first thing we need to do is specify our resource group, and this is just a logical container to put everything in. You can really just think of it like a folder for resources for a specific project or anything like that. So I'm just going to call this Jason's Spring App. So that way, as we build on this, like in the later videos, when we create a key vault or when we create a database, we can put all of those resources in this resource group. Okay, so moving down the line here, we have to provide a name for this. So I'm going to call this Jason's Spring App. And then this will also specify the default domain name for the web app. So here you can see this is going to give us the domain name jasonspringapp.azurewebsites.net. And of course, you can wire up a custom domain later if you want to. All right, so this is probably a good time for me to pause and explain what web apps are, Azure Web Apps, Azure App Service, same term. So Azure App Service is what we call a PaaS, or a platform as a service. And so for web apps, it's a platform for hosting web apps. So you can deploy your application code. You can choose your runtime here. So if I was deploying a Node or a Python application, I would just choose Python. And then I can wire up my Python application and deploy it onto this guy. But in this case, I'm doing Java. So I'm going to select Java 8 in my case. You can also do Java 11. And then you'll see here there's also an option for deploying Docker containers. And we will talk about that, but just in a later video. So for now, all you need to know is that Azure App Service is a managed platform for hosting web applications where you can deploy either your code or a container. Perfect. That was my sales voice right there. All right. So we don't need to change the Java web server stack because you can see here it's choosing Java SE embedded web server. And hopefully you already know this, but Spring Boot embeds the Tomcat web server inside the jar file. So that's why you don't have to have Tomcat running on your local machine. All you have to do is just java-jar and you point to that jar file and it'll run. So we're not going to select any other options here. We're just going to leave that as Java SE. We're going to leave this as Linux. You can choose to deploy to Windows if you want. And then next, we have to choose a region. So really, just choose the region closest to you or closest to your customers. So for me, I'm going to choose West US 2. Now let's talk about the App Service plan. The App Service plan is the compute tier for your web apps. So you can have multiple applications, multiple web apps on a single App Service plan. And the App Service plan is your logical container for all of those apps. And this is also where you define your scaling rules. So with web apps, you can automatically scale up or down depending on if you're getting higher traffic, if your applications are consuming more CPU or RAM, then you can scale up based on those metrics as well. So you may already have an app service plan. If not, we'll go through that create process here. So we'll call this Jason's App Service Plan. We'll hit OK. And here it's defaulting to Premium V2. You can change that now. You can also change that later if you want. But I'm going to go to the Review and Create blade. This will give me a summary of all of the options that I chose. And then finally, all we have to do is hit Create. All right, so now this shows that the deployment is in progress. It's creating that app service plan, and then it's going to create the Java 8 web app on top of that app service plan. So we're going to take a break here. Oh, there we go. So actually you can see it already created the app service plan. That was pretty quick. But we'll come back once all these resources are created. Okay, so the app service plan and the web app are created. It was pretty quick. I actually didn't even leave my seat. So now we'll click down here, go to resource. And now this brings me to an overview of my web app. So this is the control panel for all of the configurations and anything I could change on this web app. So actually, first things first, let's just click Browse right here. And this will open a new tab where we have the default landing page for my web app. So saying, hey, Java developers, I can go to the deployment center. I can also go to the quick start over here, and it's giving me some quick overview information about my Java version and where the Java home is located. Now, if you've literally never used Azure before, the left-hand side is where you'll do most of your navigation for a resource. So you can see here, if I click under Settings, Configuration. So this will open a new blade on the right-hand side where I can configure my web app. I can come down to Scale Out, and I could scale out to multiple instances. I don't want you to get overwhelmed, but I just want to make sure you're aware that the left-hand side is where all of your navigation is going to be. So what we're going to do now is go to the Deployment Center that's under Deployment. We'll click here. Then we're going to Settings. And then I'm going to choose GitHub. And now somewhere around here during this flow, you'll probably get prompted to authorize the GitHub OAuth application. So if you're prompted for that, make sure you go through that process, because that will allow the Azure portal to read which repositories you have. And you're going to need that because we want to set up that CI/CD pipeline. So once you've authorized the OAuth application, you're going to go ahead and select which organization the repository is in. For me, I just have the repo as a personal repo, so it's just under my Jason Freeberg account. And real quick, you might see this notification at the top that we're deploying to the production slot. Now, you can ignore that for now, and in the next video, we're going to come back and talk about what this is, but I want to get you up and running faster. So under repository, we're going to select the Simple Spring Boot app. I've got quite a few repos here, so we'll come down to Spring, where was it? Simple Spring app. So I'll select that guy, and then the main branch. And then under build, I want to choose Java 8 under the runtime stack, so Java 8. And then the final step here is that we can preview the workflow configuration. So now we get to talk about GitHub Actions, which is where the magic happens. So this is showing a preview of a YAML file that's about to get committed into our repository. So we'll take a brief look here. This is going to run every time that there's a push on the main branch, and then it's going to build and deploy our Java app. But for now, let's go ahead and close this, and then we'll hit save. And then you can see here it's setting up GitHub Actions. Perfect. So I got the green check mark, everything's good, I'm feeling good. So now let's jump over to the repository, and then let me increase the font size here. So I'm going to refresh this, and look here, there's only the source folder, but when I refresh, now there's a new folder in the repository. There's .github/workflows. And then when I click into this, there's a new file, main_jasonsspringapp.yaml. So I'll open this guy so we can take a look here. And then let me also increase the font size some more. So move myself out of the way here. Okay. So GitHub Actions is a workflow automation utility. So you can run any arbitrary task whenever there's an event in the repository. So like in this case, we said that this runs every time that there's a push on the main branch. But you could also run these scripts on a cron job. So you could run them every night, every hour if you wanted to. You could run every time there's a pull request, etc., etc. So there are some links to some docs down below. So I highly suggest you take that out, or that you open that and take a look. But what we'll do now is walk through what's happening here step by step. And if you're already familiar with GitHub Actions, make sure you use the time bar down below on this video, and you can jump ahead to the next section. but let's walk through what's going on here. So like we said earlier, it runs every time there's a push on the main branch. And there's only one job here. So the job is build and deploy, and it runs on the latest Ubuntu distro. So the first step is this checkout, and it just checks out our repository code onto the build VM. And then the next step is to set the Java version. So that was from the selector just a few minutes ago where we selected Java 8. Then the next step is to use Maven and just do a clean install. So that builds the jar file. And then the final step is to deploy to our web app. So you can see here it's deploying to JSON Spring App. We're deploying to the production slot, and we'll talk later about what the production slot is in the next video. Here we're specifying the publish profile, and if you're not familiar with that term, it's essentially just our deployment credentials. So it's a downloadable XML file that has the username and password to deploy to our site. And then finally, we have the jar file. So we're just saying go and look in the target directory and then upload the jar file. So remember, I said this runs every time that there's a push on the main branch, and this file was committed into our repository. So that means that this workflow has actually run. And if we look right here, this is the commit that added this workflow file from 3 minutes ago. And if we hover over this dot here, this is showing us that the GitHub action ran for this workflow. So I can click details here. And now this brings us to the actions tab right here. So if we look down, this has actually already run all the way through. We got the green check mark, which means that everything's perfectly fine, that there's never any bugs when there's a green check mark. That's always how it works. And here it's just the same steps as before. So remember that checkout part, setting up the Java version, building the app, deploying the app, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we can actually click into this. Let's go to the build step here. And you can read and search all of the logs here. So if you wanted to search for where Maven was called, you can see it there. You can search for anything else you wanted to. And then let's click on the Actions tab here. And this will show an overview of all of the workflow runs that have happened historically. So just as a recap on what we did here, let's go back to the code view. View code, perfect. And we'll scroll this guy back here. So quick recap. We first created a Spring Boot application, or excuse me, we created a Azure Web App on Azure. So that's what we're looking at here. Then we used the Deployment Center to wire up CI/CD, and then that committed a GitHub Actions workflow into our repository, and that workflow runs every time that there's a new push into the main branch. And whenever that push into the main branch happens, it deploys the application to our web app. So actually, if we browse to it here, we see hello from Spring Boot, and this isn't running on localhost anymore. It's running on the internet, jsonspringapp.azurewebsites.net. So anytime there's a new commit on our repository, it's going to run through that same pipeline, and it's going to deploy onto Azure. So we can actually go into our source, main, Java demo, into the controller. So here was the string here from the only controller in the application that says hello from Spring Boot. And I'm just going to edit this on the GitHub console. It's not the best practice, so don't do this at home. We're going to say hello from Azure App Service. And then I'm going to say update the string returned by controller. And then we're going to commit this directly into the main branch. Now, again, you should open a pull request, but for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and commit this right into the main branch. And now if we click over to Actions, we can see that now there's a second entry in here, and the label for it is the same commit message from earlier, update the string returned by controller. And when I click into here, I'll blow this up. This, remember, is the name of our job. There's only one of them, but if we had more jobs specified, they would just be listed down here on the left. So when I click into this guy, you can see we're already getting our logs. We're already in the build phase with Maven. It checked out our repository to the build VM. It set up our Java version. And now it's building with Maven, and the next step will be to deploy to the web app. So that's what it's doing right now. And then let's jump back to the code view real quick. Back to Actions. So while this is running, I'm going to just take a quick break and say, go ahead and comment down below if you have any questions or other things that you want me to cover about Java in Azure or Java on App Service. I have an idea for what I want to cover next, but of course, I'm always open to suggestions. And perfect. So now we've got the green check mark. The workflow ran. Build and deploy. Looks good. So now let's try refreshing this here, and perfect, there we go. So hello from Azure App Service. So now as you build on your application, as you add more controllers, add more features to your application, anytime you commit those into the repository, they'll get deployed right to the production site. Okay, great. So I hope you learned a lot. Hope you enjoyed the video. Check the links down below for helpful resources. And like I said, if you have any questions or want to see more scenarios about Java on Azure, please go ahead and comment below. All right. Have a good one. Thank you.